Hi there, thanks for joining me for this third crit, and thanks to Gary for sending this set of images through to me. You say that your work has a recurring theme that you call urban landscapes. You continue saying that you've drifted in and out of the new topographic field, but that the most strongly recurring theme is one of patterns and line. I'm going to go through the images in more detail and look at elements that are starting to work. But when I look at the whole project, I don't get a sense of a very clear, distinct message coming through. When you say you drift into new topographics, that means that the landscapes that you're taking are engaging with the dehumanization aspect of urban sprawl. So then your message needs to be clear, showing that particular aspect within a scene that you choose to photograph. And it reflects how you feel about that scene. On the other hand, if you are looking at line and shape, then you've got to stick to that. Don't try and mix the two themes because it's a challenge. You're either telling the one story or the other. And so what I'll discuss in this video is how I feel that you haven't possibly committed sufficiently to one theme. Now, given what I've said about the whole body of work, I'll start to look at some of the images that I feel have something going and you can start to tighten things up. Okay, let's do that. I'll start with this image. I like the isolation of the blue, which draws your eye towards the flag. There's also a nice line here on the left. The dark areas and shadows help to draw your eye towards the top right-hand quadrant. But if you look at the whole photograph, you get a bit confused as to what you're saying. Am I looking at this information on the left or am I looking at the building? If you're going to focus on the abstract line and shape, then this would have been your framing. You've got diagonal lines, very interesting shapes, repetitions, nice line down here. Let me go back to the original. These aspects are kind of hidden in the shade on the left. Another possible focus can be seen by looking at this crop. So there are interesting things going on, but when I look at the full frame, I, as the viewer, am left thinking, what are you trying to tell me? The second shot I'd consider to be more in the new topographic category, because there's a repetition of the structures that hints at the monotony of shapes. And this is the kind of thing that one focuses on in new topographic suburban scenes. The message that you're possibly communicating is that the repetitive nature of these structures causes a sense of sameness and therefore boredom or repulsion to that. When I change the photograph into black and white, this sameness of structures, I think, becomes emphasized. In this example, you are possibly mixing line and new topographics. You get a sense of a lot of city paraphernalia dominating the photograph. The electricity box, the refuse bins, the repetition of the satellite dishes, and these cables running through and the vacant parking lot. So these elements make the viewer think that this is a slightly oppressive scene. On the other hand, you could say that perhaps you were going after line and shape. And then these different cables are dissecting the photograph, and you've also got these nice shapes in the background. This becomes interesting. So if you're just looking for line and shape, these details are what you've got to look for. This aspect of the frame then becomes your primary focus, or something that's similar to this. But you haven't quite committed, again, in this case, to what you're trying to show me. I'm not getting a clear message from this photograph. This image falls short in a similar way. I like the structure. It's got an appealing curve to it. It conveys a feeling of brutal iron. The way I'm responding to the image, I feel that you need to emphasize this particular element. Unfortunately, there's a lot of space that's filled with what I'd call unenergetic information. It becomes wasted space and dilutes the focus. If I had my editing knife, I would do the following. Start by moving your camera position maybe to the left so that the Uptown bike sign becomes completely visible. It has too much of a presence to really cut it off the way it is in this frame. I think a slightly longer lens would also compress the elements. But what you've got now isn't bad because there's a diagonal line and then there's stuff happening here and then there's stuff happening on this side. You've got a repetition of the blue on top and blue on the bottom, and you've got things like this, the sign that holds your eye. Not only is this part interesting, but these shapes are interesting. And I like the repetition of that. So there's lots of interesting elements that you could be playing with, but what you're doing is settling for an average shot with a lot of things, rather than, say, a powerful shot of something specific. In this photograph, I think what attracted you is the line and the shapes of the old metal bridge railings. I don't see any new topographic message coming through, so I'll concentrate on the line and shape. I'm going to move over to a crop. So what I've done is bring up the detail within this kind of beautiful old metal bridge, and the lines are fantastic and the shapes are great. So purely from an abstract point of view, this is an appealing photograph. What I've done is taken out the background. Let me just show you again the previous image. It's an average scene behind, but it kind of distracts from the actual subject, which is your bridge metal structure. You either want to show me a picture of the river and town, or you're showing me this, which is an abstract view of the old bridge. I'm going back again now to your framing. What do you want to show me here? You lose me as a viewer because there's no specific focus. I would then say, if you're determined to capture the scene, perhaps you've got to consider other options. Maybe it looks different at night and the background isn't so obvious. Maybe there's lighting under the bridge. Perhaps there's another point along the length of the bridge where you can isolate the structure against a more clear background. You know, if it doesn't have to be absolutely clear. If you have, say, clouds wandering around here, it maybe adds something. But there's also a possibility that this shot just doesn't exist. The central structure might be the same bridge as the last image. The shape here is repeated again above, and you've got this line at the bottom. But when you look at the whole photograph, you get lost in these non-spaces. Here, 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 and here. Without these 4 spaces, the graphic elements might be interesting enough. But I think what you've got to say is, I've got to rethink how I'm going to look at this. Perhaps if you visualize the image in black and white, then you can deal with these elements in a way that won't detract from the subject. In fact, it might enhance the subject. So these large areas that didn't have much interest in the color image now become dark negative space elements. It's got a whole different feel, and I think it sort of starts to have a bit of vuma to it. So Gary, I hope I haven't been too strict so far pushing my point about committing to a single subject. But let me sum up so far. In the last 3 line shape images, you haven't gone far enough to isolate that subject. Similarly, in the next 2 images, which kind of lean towards a new topographic feel, you haven't, in my mind, gone far enough to push your message. In this scene, the broader view is potentially beautiful, the impressive mountain range and the clear sky, and you've got this urban clutter littering the idyllic landscape. So that would be a new topographic message. What stops this image, though, from making an impact on the social commentary level is that this shape in particular is fairly bland. And you need something to make this message sing. The urban elements they don't add up to a kind of powerful statement. This is a bit crude, obviously, and an overstatement, but let's say someone buried a car or something interesting. Then your message it would have far more impact. The more general scene just doesn't crack it as a new topographic image because you're not going all the way. Okay, I'm going to put you out of your misery soon, Gary. I like this image, but for me it would have been a whole lot stronger if you hadn't included the person. Because your real subject within the new topographic idea is the old greenhouse. So when I take this woman out, then suddenly it becomes a study in green about a greenhouse. And one's eye immediately goes to the old structure and how the foliage is covering it. And it becomes a commentary about how over time things that we build and value slowly fade and eventually, in this case, become swallowed up by the environment. There are, of course, other ideas that one can read into the image. If you converted the image to black and white, it further changes the tone of the message. Okay, Gary, I'm going to leave it there. Thanks again. And I really appreciate it because I find it interesting to look at new work and engage with the technical as well as the cerebral aspects of the work. I hope that my feedback adds to your practice of photography and that it might motivate you to engage possibly on a different level with your decisions. Thanks very much for joining me, everybody, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.